I built my off-grid cabin with my own hands. 3 years, solar panels, rainwater system, 14 acres of Pennsylvania woods. No outside rules, pure self-sufficiency. Then she glides up in a white Cadillac, steps out, locks eyes, and sneers.
This doesn't belong here. And neither do you.
I walked back inside. 20 minutes later, $2,400 fine taped to my front door. Constance, brand new HOA president, high on her little throne. She went after my solar, my water system, my right to exist on land I own outright. I'm a retired electrician, no law degree, no cash for lawyers. What I had, time, a library card, and one fatal flaw she left buried in her own HOA bylaws. She had zero clue I'd find it, and what I did with it, in just 30 days, made her wish she'd never pulled into my driveway. Ever had someone with a little power make your life hell? Drop your state below and tell me how far they pushed you. Let me back up, because context matters here, and the backstory is half the reason this whole thing hit different. My name is Garrett Winslow, and I'm not some trust fund homesteader who bought a cute piece of land and called it rustic living. I'm a 54-year-old former electrician from western Pennsylvania who spent 28 years running wire in commercial buildings, raising 2 kids mostly alone after my wife Denise passed from ovarian cancer in 2017. When the kids were grown and gone, my daughter Paige off to nursing school in Columbus, my son Reed working pipeline in North Dakota, I looked around at my rented apartment in Harrisburg and thought, this isn't living, this is waiting to die indoors. I'd always wanted land, real land, not a quarter acre with HOA-approved mulch colors, but actual acreage where I could build something from nothing. I found it in 2021, 14 acres in the Pinecrest Ridge area of rural central Pennsylvania, a patch of mixed hardwood and meadow about 4 miles outside a small town called Dunmore Falls. The price was right because the land was raw. No utilities, no cleared road, no nothing. That was the appeal. I spent the next 2 years doing it right. I filed permits through the county, building permit, septic waiver, electrical exemption for off-grid systems. I put up a modest 960 square foot timber frame cabin, 2-story, with a wraparound porch. I installed a 6 kilowatt solar array with battery backup, a 3,000-gallon rainwater cistern with a UV filtration system, and a wood gasification boiler that could heat the place on 2 cords of wood per winter. I also kept a small diesel generator, the backup to the backup, that smelled like every honest job I'd ever worked. The cabin wasn't flashy. Raw cedar siding, metal roof, big south-facing windows for passive solar. It sat on a gentle slope overlooking a seasonal creek. When the morning light came through those windows in October, hitting the knotty pine interior walls, it looked like something out of a dream I'd been having for 30 years. Here's the thing nobody warned me about. My 14 acres happened to sit within the legal boundaries of the Pinecrest Ridge HOA. I didn't know this when I bought the land. The listing didn't mention it. The real estate agent, a cheerful young man named Derek, who smelled like car air freshener and barely looked at the title documents, didn't flag it. The HOA had expanded its jurisdiction in 2019 through a county annexation process that nobody living on undeveloped parcels had been notified of. That detail becomes very important later. So I built my cabin, got my county permits, moved in, and spent the better part of a year living peacefully. Then, Pinecrest Ridge HOA got a new board president. Her name was Constance Aberfoyle. Constance was 61, recently retired from a career in municipal contract management, and she had moved into Pinecrest Ridge's primary residential cluster, a neighborhood of 74 cookie-cutter homes about 2 miles from my parcel, approximately 8 months before the fine showed up on my door. She had been elected HOA board president at a poorly attended annual meeting where she ran unopposed and won with 11 votes. 11. I would later learn that the previous president had resigned after Constance joined the board and made his life miserable for 6 weeks straight. Constance drove a white Cadillac SUV with a custom plate that read PRSDRGE. She had opinions about fence heights, lawn equipment decibel levels, and apparently my entire existence. The first unfair act wasn't the fine, actually. 2 weeks before the orange envelope arrived, Constance sent a certified letter informing me I needed to submit an architectural review application for structures I had already built, permitted, and been living in for 11 months. The application fee? $350. The review timeline? Up to 90 days. The implied message? We know you're here, and we don't like it. I filed that first letter in a drawer and went back to splitting firewood. The thwack of the maul, the smell of fresh split oak. I figured I'd deal with it eventually. I should have dealt with it that day. The $2,400 fine letter arrived on a Thursday morning in early March, and by that afternoon I was sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, a cup of black coffee, and the growing realization that I had underestimated Constance Aberfoyle significantly. The fine was itemized. That's what got me. It wasn't a vague penalty. It was a surgical document. $800 for unapproved permanent structure, my cabin. $600 for non-permitted energy generation equipment, my solar array. $500 for unauthorized water collection system, my cistern. $300 for aesthetic non-compliance, exterior materials, my cedar siding apparently. And $200 for, and I'm reading this directly, failure to submit required documentation within the architectural review window. The documentation they'd asked for 2 weeks ago, that I hadn't sent yet. I called the HOA management company, a firm called Elevate Community Solutions, based out of Camp Hill. The woman who answered put me on hold for 4 minutes, then connected me to a property manager named Dwight Feeney, who spoke in the careful, rehearsed tone of someone who had delivered bad news to angry homeowners so many times he'd stopped feeling anything about it. Mr. Winslow, the fines are valid under the Pinecrest Ridge CC&Rs as adopted in 2019, Dwight told me. I wasn't notified of those CC&Rs, I said. The annexation was recorded with the county. Recorded documents are considered constructive notice. Constructive notice, meaning we put it in a filing cabinet somewhere, so legally you should have known. Takeaway. When you buy land, always search for HOA annexation records at the county recorder's office, not just deed restrictions from the seller. I asked for a complete copy of the CC&RS, the 2019 annexation filing, and the meeting minutes from every board meeting in the past 3 years. Dwight sighed in a way that suggested he'd been hoping I'd just pay the fine. He said he'd process the request. That weekend, I drove into Dunmore Falls and stopped at the public library, which had a county records terminal. I started reading. The Pinecrest Ridge HOA had been a sleepy little association for most of its existence, formed in 1994 to manage the residential cluster, dealing with nothing more dramatic than parking complaints and Christmas light timers. Then, in 2019, the board at the time had voted to expand the HOA's jurisdictional boundary to include surrounding undeveloped parcels. The legal rationale was a Pennsylvania HOA statute that allows boundary expansion if the expansion is approved by 2/3 of existing members and recorded properly. The vote had passed, 51 to 24. 75 members had voted out of 74 homes, which was mathematically interesting. I wrote that down. 3 days after my library visit, the documents from Dwight arrived. A thick envelope that smelled of toner and bureaucratic indifference. I spread the CC&Rs across my kitchen table and started reading with a yellow highlighter. I'm an electrician by trade, not a lawyer, but I've read enough building codes in my life to know how to find the teeth in a document. I found something in Article 7, Section 4 of the CC&Rs. It was a clause about pre-existing improvements. Specifically, it stated that any structure or installation that predated the HOA's recorded jurisdiction over a parcel was considered a grandfathered improvement and was exempt from architectural review requirements and aesthetic compliance fines, provided the improvement had been permitted by the applicable county or municipal authority. I had county permits for everything, every single item on that fine. I called Dwight back. I'd like to dispute these fines under Article 7, Section 4, I said. My solar array, cistern, and cabin were all built and permitted before the annexation was recorded. There was a pause. The annexation was recorded in October 2019. When was your cabin built? Permitted in March 2021 and completed in November 2022. Another pause. Longer this time. That's after the annexation. And there it was. My grandfathering argument had a fatal flaw. The annexation predated my construction. I had built everything after Pinecrest Ridge technically had jurisdiction. I just hadn't known about it. I sat with that for a moment. The fire in the wood stove ticked and popped. Outside, a pair of crows argued in the bare oak trees. Constance hadn't made a mistake. She had timed this perfectly, waiting until I was fully invested, fully built, fully moved in before dropping the hammer. Because if she'd caught me earlier, I might have walked away. Now I had 3 years of labor and a cabin I'd built in memory of a life I was rebuilding. I wasn't walking away. But I also wasn't going to win this by arguing grandfathering clauses I couldn't make stick. I needed a different angle. And I had a feeling the answer was buried somewhere in that 2019 annexation vote that somehow produced 75 votes from 74 homes. I need to pause here and tell you about my neighbor, because no story about fighting back is a solo act. Thelonious Brackett, Theo to everyone who knew him, owned a 22-acre parcel about a half-mile east of mine, along the same ridgeline. Theo was 67, a retired civil engineer from the Pennsylvania DOT, built like a fireplace, with a gray beard he'd stopped trimming sometime around 2018. He'd been living on his land full-time since retirement, in a converted Morton building, essentially a steel barn he'd insulated, drywalled, and turned into one of the most functional homes I'd ever been inside. It had a geothermal heat pump, radiant floor heating, and a workshop that would make any mechanic weep with envy. Theo had received his own HOA fine 3 weeks before mine, $3,100, for the converted barn structure primarily. He'd already called a real estate attorney in Harrisburg named Vivian Storch. Vivian was sharp, boutique firm, specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. When Theo mentioned that his neighbor had also gotten a fine and was finding irregularities in the 2019 annexation vote, Vivian said, "Tell your neighbor to come in." I drove to Harrisburg on a Tuesday. Vivian's office smelled like old law books and fresh coffee, a combination I now associate with hope. She was in her late 40s, direct, and she did not waste words. "Walk me through what you found," she said. I laid out the math. 75 votes from 74 homes. 1 extra vote. Vivian nodded slowly. In Pennsylvania, HOA expansion votes are governed by the Uniform Planned Community Act. For a boundary expansion, you need a 2/3 supermajority of eligible members. 1 fraudulent vote could invalidate the entire expansion if the margin was close enough. The actual vote had been 51 to 24. 2/3 of 75 was exactly 50. So the expansion passed by a single vote. If that 75th vote was fraudulent, if one person had voted twice, or if someone had cast a ballot on behalf of a vacant lot or an ineligible parcel, the expansion would have failed. Takeaway: HOA expansion votes are legally binding actions under state property law, and a 1-vote margin with a counting irregularity can void an entire jurisdictional change. Vivian filed a formal records request with Pinecrest Ridge for the original 2019 ballot materials. Under Pennsylvania's Uniform Planned Community Act, HOA boards are required to maintain voting records for a minimum of 7 years and must produce them upon request from any member or affected party. Here's where it got interesting. The HOA initially ignored the request. Then Dwight from Elevate Community Solutions sent a letter saying the records were unavailable due to a transition in management software. Then Constance Aberfoyle sent a letter, personally, on HOA letterhead with her name embossed at the top, which I found both impressive and deeply telling, stating that the 2019 vote had been properly conducted and certified, and that further challenges were not actionable. Vivian responded to Constance's letter with a 2-paragraph note that I will summarize as, "That's not how any of this works, and we'll be seeing you in discovery." Meanwhile, Constance had apparently decided that legal pushback was a sign that she needed to escalate. The HOA sent a second notice, this one threatening to place a lien on my property if the $2,400 fine wasn't paid within 15 days. A property lien. On a cabin I owned free and clear, that I'd built with my hands, on land I'd paid cash for. I want to be precise about how that felt. Standing on my porch in the early April cold, holding that lien notice, the creek down the slope running fast with snowmelt, the air sharp and clean. It felt like someone had reached into my chest with a bureaucratic fist. Not because I was scared of losing the cabin, but because this was the specific kind of petty cruelty that Constance had refined to an art form, using legal process as a weapon rather than a remedy. The lien threat was also a strategic error on her part, though she didn't know that yet. In Pennsylvania, placing a lien on a property that is actively subject to a legitimate legal dispute, particularly one involving a disputed jurisdictional claim, can constitute an improper cloud on title. It's not automatically illegal, but if the underlying debt is later found invalid, the lien holder can face penalties, including the homeowner's attorney fees. Vivian sent them a letter saying exactly that. She also CC'd the Pennsylvania Bureau of Consumer Protection and the state's HOA Ombudsman program. The lien was quietly withdrawn 4 days later. Score: Garrett 1, Constance 0. But she was just getting warmed up. April turned the ridgeline green almost overnight, the way it does in central Pennsylvania. 1 week, bare trees and gray sky. The next, a sudden explosion of yellow-green that makes you understand why people used to think magic was real. I was out checking my solar panel array connections when Theo drove up in his mud-streaked F-350, rolled down the window and said, "She's organizing the neighborhood against us." Constance had called a community information meeting at the Pinecrest Ridge Clubhouse, a beige 1990s building with industrial carpet and ceiling tiles that had seen better decades. The meeting was not officially a board meeting, which meant it didn't require advance notice under the HOA bylaws. Smart. She had framed the meeting as a discussion about maintaining community standards and addressing the impact of non-compliant properties on home values. Non-compliant properties, plural. She was painting a picture of the whole ridgeline as a threat. Theo had a friend inside, a woman named Paulette Greer, who owned one of the residential cluster homes and had been increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of Constance's leadership. Paulette attended the meeting and texted Theo a running summary that read like a transcript of a neighborhood HOA villain's origin story. Constance showed slides, actual PowerPoint slides. One slide showed aerial photos of Theo's converted barn and my cabin, circled in red, with a caption that read, "Unregulated development threatening Pinecrest Ridge property values." Another slide showed comparable home sale data, which she had clearly cherry-picked, suggesting that the presence of non-standard rural development within HOA boundaries correlated with declining values. She also said, and Paulette texted this nearly verbatim, "These are the kinds of properties that attract a certain type of resident who doesn't share our community values." A certain type of resident. I want to be careful here, because I don't throw accusations around lightly. But Theo, who is black, noted that this kind of language has a specific history and a specific intent. He'd heard versions of it before. I hadn't, but I believed him, and I was angry on his behalf in a way that straightened my spine differently than the financial dispute had. We brought this to Vivian. She noted it carefully. She said it wasn't by itself an actionable fair housing violation without more pattern evidence. But it was exactly the kind of thing that became very important context if there were additional incidents. Document everything, she told us. Dates, exact words, who was present. We documented. Meanwhile, Constance made her next move. She submitted a complaint to the county zoning office, alleging that my rainwater cistern constituted an unauthorized impoundment under the county's stormwater management ordinance. This was, and I say this with professional appreciation for audacity, completely made up. Pennsylvania law explicitly permits residential rainwater harvesting systems under the Clean Streams Law, with no permit required for residential use under 5,000 gallons. My cistern held 3,000 gallons. The county zoning office sent an inspector. He looked at my cistern, looked at my UV filtration system, asked me what kind of pump I used, and said, "This is all fine." Who called this in? I told him. He wrote something in his notepad and left. 3 days later, Constance received a letter from the county zoning office informing her that filing a frivolous complaint in order to harass a property owner could constitute a violation of the county's regulations on complaint procedures and could result in the complainant being billed for inspection costs. She got a $175 inspection bill. I framed my copy of that notice and put it on my workshop wall. But the stormwater gambit told me something important. Constance wasn't operating alone. She was organized, she had access to legal templates, and she understood enough about regulatory systems to use them as weapons. someone was advising her. And Elevate Community Solutions, Dwight Feeney's management company, was still processing my fines as valid and accruing interest. I started pulling the thread on Elevate Community Solutions. What I found took about 4 hours of public record searching, 2 cups of coffee, and 1 very productive phone call with a retired HOA board member from a different community who had dealt with Elevate before, a guy named Hargrove Finch, who ran a Facebook group called HOA Abuse Survivors of Central PA with 1,400 members. Hargrove had a spreadsheet. Of course he did. Hargrove Finch was the kind of man who kept records the way other people kept grudges, meticulously, permanently, and with deep personal satisfaction. He'd been documenting Elevate Community Solutions for 3 years. His spreadsheet tracked 14 different HOA communities managed by Elevate in the central Pennsylvania region, cross-referencing fine amounts, lien filings, dispute outcomes, and one particular column he'd labeled Management Fee Escalation Events. Here's what the column showed. In every community where Elevate had managed the transition to a new board president, their management fee had increased within 18 months, usually coinciding with a surge in enforcement activity. More fines, more liens, more architectural review fees. The pattern was consistent. New, aggressive board president comes in, fines go up, management fees go up. Elevate prospered when homeowners were in conflict. But the real reveal came from the Pinecrest Ridge management contract itself, which Vivian had obtained through the records request. I'm going to break this down simply because it matters enormously. The contract between Pinecrest Ridge HOA and Elevate Community Solutions had a standard fee structure, a flat monthly management fee, but it also had a performance addendum. Specifically, Elevate received a 12% administrative processing fee on all fines collected and all lien placement fees charged to homeowners. They had a financial incentive to generate fines. Takeaway: always request and read the full management contract between your HOA and its management company. Specifically, any provisions linking management compensation to fine collection or enforcement activity. It gets better. The 2019 annexation that had brought my land under HOA jurisdiction, the resolution expanding the HOA's boundaries, had been drafted by Elevate Community Solutions on behalf of the then board. Elevate had effectively designed the expansion that tripled the number of parcels subject to their enforcement and their fee-generating potential. And the 2019 board president who had pushed through that expansion vote, a man named Daryl Crutchfield, who had since moved out of state. Vivian tracked him down through a LinkedIn profile. He was currently working as a regional director for, you already guessed it, Elevate Community Solutions. The expansion wasn't just a power grab by a neighborhood association. It was a revenue development strategy by a management company. Constance Aberfoyle, whether she fully understood it or not, was playing the role Elevate had designed for her, the aggressive enforcer who generated the conflict that generated the fees. This changed everything. We weren't dealing with a petty neighborhood dispute. We were dealing with a private company that had captured a community governance structure and was operating it as a profit center, using discriminatory language and frivolous regulatory complaints as supplementary enforcement tools. Vivian filed a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania Real Estate Commission, which has oversight authority over HOA management companies. She also sent a letter to the Pinecrest Ridge Board, all 5 members, laying out the conflict of interest in plain language and attaching the relevant contract clause, the management fee data from Hargrove's spreadsheet, and the documentation of Daryl Crutchfield's current employment. 3 of the 5 board members did not respond. One, a man named Obadiah Rourke, who had been on the board since 2016 and had watched Constance's rise with increasing discomfort, called Theo directly. "Tell your attorney," Obadiah said quietly, "to look at the December 2019 board minutes, specifically page 4. We pulled the December 2019 board minutes. Page 4 contained a line item buried in the consent agenda, the approval of a $1,500 consulting fee paid to Elevate Community Solutions for annexation documentation services, paid from the HOA reserve fund without a membership vote. In the same month, the annexation vote was held. The same company that drafted the expansion got paid to draft the expansion, from the community's own money, without telling the community. We had them." The planning phase began on a Saturday morning in early May, around my kitchen table, with Vivian on speakerphone, Theo in the chair across from me nursing a thermos of coffee that smelled like it could sandblast paint, and Hargrove Finch joining via video call from his home office, his wall of HOA binders visible behind him, like the background of a man who has chosen a very specific calling. The strategy had 4 interconnected components, and I want to walk through all of them, because each one is something any homeowner in this situation could understand and potentially use. The first was the legal challenge to the annexation. Vivian was preparing a petition to the Court of Common Pleas to void the 2019 jurisdictional expansion on 2 grounds: the voting irregularity, 75 votes from 74 homes, and the undisclosed conflict of interest in the process, Elevate drafting and being paid for the expansion. In Pennsylvania, a conflict of interest in an HOA board vote, particularly one involving undisclosed financial benefit to a contracting party, can be grounds for voiding the action entirely. If the annexation was voided, my fines, Theo's fines, and every other fine levied against Ridgeline property owners under that expanded jurisdiction were legally nullified. All of them. The second component was the Elevate Community Solutions regulatory complaint. Vivian had filed with the Real Estate Commission, but we also filed with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, specifically citing the performance-based fine collection fee structure as a potential unfair trade practice. In Pennsylvania, if a consumer-facing business structures its compensation to incentivize activity that financially harms the consumer, that can fall under the state's Unfair Trade Practices and Consumer Protection Law, a statute with real teeth, including treble damages. The third component was the board itself. We needed to flip it. The HOA's annual meeting was scheduled for the 3rd week of June, 6 weeks away. Under the Pinecrest Ridge bylaws, any member in good standing, meaning any property owner within the HOA's jurisdiction, including Theo and me, could run for the board. With the annexation under legal challenge, our membership status was contested. But Vivienne argued that until and unless we were formally adjudicated as non-members, we had standing to participate. The HOA couldn't simultaneously argue we owed fines as members and deny us member rights. So Theo and I, along with Paulette Greer from the residential cluster and 2 other Ridgeline property owners we'd identified, a woman named Celeste Okafor, who had gotten a fine for her vegetable garden, and a retired schoolteacher named Ferdinand Voss, who'd been fined for a storage shed, announced our candidacy for the 5 open board seats at the annual meeting. We sent formal written notice to every HOA member, all 74 residential cluster homeowners, plus the 23 Ridgeline parcel owners now under HOA jurisdiction. 97 notices, hand-delivered on a Sunday morning by Hargrove Finch, who described it as the best day of his retirement. The fourth component was what Theo called the physical anchor. His engineering background had suggested something I'd been thinking about, but hadn't fully articulated. The annual meeting was held at the clubhouse, a space the HOA controlled. Constance could theoretically disrupt the meeting, challenge member eligibility, or simply refuse to seat newly elected board members. We needed witnesses she couldn't dismiss, documentation she couldn't shred, and leverage she couldn't outmaneuver in the moment. We reached out to a reporter at the Dunmore Falls Courier, a local weekly named Bridget Sauer, who had been covering a separate story about Elevate Community Solutions in another county. Bridget was very interested in attending the annual meeting as press. We also contacted the county's district magistrate office to ask whether a community member could request a neutral observer for HOA elections, where the validity of the election process was under legal dispute. The answer was yes, and a retired magistrate named Walter Drummond volunteered to serve as an independent election monitor. Walter Drummond was 71, white-haired, and carried the specific gravity of a man who had spent decades watching people misbehave in official settings. When we met him at his kitchen table to go over the process, his border collie asleep on the braided rug and the smell of wood polish in the air, he looked at our documentation and said simply, "This is a clear case of captured governance." He agreed to attend. Finally, we filmed everything. Theo had a good DSLR and a working knowledge of video. We set up a simple, single-camera documentation setup for the meeting. Not for YouTube, for the court record. And then we waited for Constance to make the move we knew she'd make, We didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks before the annual meeting, Constance made her first desperation play. She sent a formal notice to all 97 property owners, informing them that the board had voted, in an emergency executive session, without public notice, which was itself a potential bylaw violation, to clarify the membership eligibility rules for the annual meeting. The new interpretation: only property owners within the original 1994 HOA boundary, meaning only the 74 residential cluster homes, were eligible to vote or stand for election at the annual meeting. In one motion, she had tried to strip Theo, me, Celeste, Ferdinand, and 19 other Ridgeline property owners of our voting rights for the same community whose rules she was using to fine us. The logic was breathtaking in its circular audacity. We were members when it came to being fined, but not members when it came to having a voice. Vivian sent an emergency motion to the court the next morning, requesting a temporary restraining order prohibiting the HOA from enforcing the new eligibility interpretation pending resolution of the annexation challenge. The judge, reviewing it on a Friday afternoon, which I imagine she was thrilled about, granted a limited TRO specifically protecting the voting rights of Ridgeline parcel owners at the upcoming annual meeting. The order was served to Constance personally by a process server who drove out to Pinecrest Ridge on a Saturday. I was told Constance stood in her doorway for a long moment, reading the TRO, then asked the process server, "Who authorized this?" "The Court of Common Pleas, ma'am," the server said. She closed the door. 3 days later, Dwight Feeney from Elevate Community Solutions called Vivian directly. This was unusual. Elevate had been communicating through attorneys up to this point. Dwight's call was brief and off the record, but Vivian summarized it for us as, he wanted to know if there was a settlement structure that didn't involve the Attorney General's office. We were not interested in that conversation yet. Then Constance's second desperation play arrived, and it was uglier than the first. Someone sent anonymous letters to 3 of the 5 board members, the 3 who had been silent when Obadiah Rourke reached out to us, containing what appeared to be printed screenshots of a Facebook profile. The profile, which had been created recently and was clearly fake, purported to belong to Theo and contained fabricated posts, including racially inflammatory content, statements about not following HOA rules because the HOA doesn't apply to people like me, and a photo that was not Theo, but was intended to look plausibly like him from a distance. Theo brought this to Vivian immediately. He was calm in the way that people get when they are very, very angry. "This is what they do," he said, "when they run out of legal moves." The fake profile had been created from an IP address. It had been reported to Facebook within hours and taken down, but Theo had screenshots of everything: creation date, posting history, the works. Vivian added this to a growing supplemental filing for the Attorney General's complaint, now flagging potential cyberstalking and identity fraud. We also quietly contacted the 3 board members who had received the letters. 2 of them, when we showed them documentation proving the profile was fake, were visibly shaken. One of them, a woman named Arlene Toftness, who had been on the board for 3 years and had spent most of that time watching Constance steamroll everyone, said, "I've been meaning to tell you, the December 2019 consulting fee payment? I wasn't on the board then, but I found out about it later. I brought it up to Constance and she told me it was standard practice. I didn't push hard enough." Arlene agreed to sign an affidavit. She also agreed to vote at the annual meeting. The week before the meeting, Constance made her third and most visible move. She posted flyers at the Pinecrest Ridge mailbox cluster, the central mailbox station shared by the residential cluster, accusing Theo and me of planning to seize control of the HOA for personal financial benefit, and urging residents to vote to protect our community. The flyers were unsigned, but had a clip art border that perfectly matched the aesthetic of every other Constance Aberfoyle communication I'd ever received. Paulette Greer photographed the flyers before they could be removed. She posted them to the private Facebook group Hargrove ran, where they were received with a chorus of responses from former Elevate-managed communities that I will describe only as enthusiastic. The meeting was 4 days away. We were ready. The 4 days before the annual meeting were the quietest and most focused stretch of the entire 30-plus days since this had started. While Constance was flinging flyers and fake Facebook profiles, we were doing something much less dramatic and much more dangerous to her. We were counting votes. Theo had the engineer's gift for thinking in systems. He'd built a simple spreadsheet, no Hargrove-level binder archive, just a clean tracking document. Of all 97 property owners, their contact information, their known positions based on conversations we or Paulette had had with them, and their likelihood of attending the annual meeting. Pennsylvania HOA law requires a quorum for a valid annual meeting. For Pinecrest Ridge, that quorum was 25% of eligible members. Under our court order, that meant 25% of all 97 members, 25 bodies. We had confirmed attendance commitments from 41 people by the Monday before the Thursday meeting. Several of them were residential cluster homeowners who had watched Constance's behavior for 8 months and were quietly exhausted by it. 3 of them were neighbors who had received their own minor fines, parking violations, trash can placement, one truly surreal fine for wind chimes, and had been paying them silently, not knowing they had options. The evening before the meeting, Theo and I sat on my porch watching the last of the May light fade over the ridge. The creek was barely audible, just a whisper through the new leaves. I had a beer, he had his thermos. Neither of us said much for a while. "You know this isn't the end, right?" he said eventually. "Even if we win tomorrow, someone else is going to have to do the work. Run the thing properly." "I know," I said. "You ready for that?" I thought about Denise, who had always been the one with the patience for committees and meetings, and the long, slow work of making things better. I thought about building this cabin in her memory, trying to make something that lasted. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." Vivian arrived the next morning at 8. Bridget Sauer from the Courier showed up at 8:30 with a photographer. Walter Drummond, the election monitor, arrived at 8:45 in a pressed button-down, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been with him since the Carter administration. We had set up our own documentation table just inside the clubhouse entrance, a folding table with a sign that read, "Member check-in/document review, open to all." We had printed copies of the TRO, the Vivian letter about the conflict of interest, a one-page summary of the Elevate compensation structure, and a brief, clear explanation of what was on the ballot today. Not propaganda, facts. Sourced, documented, verifiable facts. Constance arrived at 9 o'clock to a room that was already half full of people she had not expected to show up. She walked in and stopped. I watched her read the room, the folding table, the sign, Walter Drummond's official presence with his notepad, Bridget Sauer's press badge, the 35 or so people already seated, many of whom she clearly recognized as faces she'd seen at previous meetings, but never expected to see opposing her. For the first time since this had started, I saw something flicker across Constance Aberfoyle's face that was not confidence. She walked to the front of the room and took her seat at the board table. She arranged her papers. She did not look at us. Dwight Feeney from Elevate was notably absent. We found out later he'd called in sick. His assistant, a nervous young man named Percival, was there instead, and he spent most of the pre-meeting period looking at his phone, with the expression of someone who would very much like to be somewhere else. The meeting was called to order at 9:30. Walter Drummond stood at that point and introduced himself as the independent election monitor, explained his role, read the relevant portion of the TRO regarding Ridgeline member voting rights, and announced that all 97 members of record were eligible to vote. His voice had the particular authority of a man who had presided over a lot of rooms and was completely unbothered by any of them. Constance's face went very still. There were 54 people in the room. Quorum was 25. We had more than double. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and I am going to tell you about the moment that mattered most. But first, I need to describe the physical setup, because the visual of that room matters. The Pinecrest Ridge clubhouse had folding chairs arranged in rows, facing a long table where the 5 current board members sat. Constance was at the center. To her left, 2 members who had been silent through everything. To her right, the 3rd silent member, and Obadiah Rourke, who kept his eyes forward and his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who knows exactly what is about to happen. The walls were beige. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. There were framed photos of Pinecrest Ridge from the 1990s, the original cluster, new and neat, full of promise. The carpet smelled like decades of HOA meetings, which is to say, it smelled like burnt coffee and suppressed frustration. At the back of the room, near the entrance, our documentation table. Bridget Sauer's photographer had set up near the side wall. Walter Drummond sat at a small separate desk near the front, apart from the board table, with his notepad and his quiet authority. The first portion of the meeting was standard business. Then Vivian, attending as our legal representative with the right to address the board under the HOA bylaws open forum provision, stood and walked through the legal findings, calmly, precisely. The 75-vote anomaly, the undisclosed Elevate consulting fee, the performance-based fine collection structure, the fake social media profile, and its referral to the Attorney General's office, the TRO. She handed the board a formal demand: rescind all fines issued to Ridgeline property owners under the disputed annexation, place the Elevate management contract under immediate review, and call a special meeting to vote on the annexation's validity pending the court proceeding. Constance cut her off before she finished. These allegations are unsubstantiated, and this is not the appropriate forum. They're documented, Vivian said pleasantly. I have copies for everyone in the room. She nodded to Theo, who stood and began distributing a stapled packet to every person present. The sound of 54 packets being handled simultaneously is, I will tell you, a very satisfying sound. Constance tried to table the discussion. She called for a vote to move to the election portion of the meeting and bypass the forum. The vote was 3-2 against her. Obadiah and Arlene Toftness, who had been silent for so long, voted to continue the forum. The room went very quiet. Then a residential cluster homeowner named B. Strickland stood up without being recognized and said, I've lived here for 18 years, and I've never seen this community act the way it's acted this year. I've watched neighbors get threatened and fined and harassed, and I want to know, on the record with the press here, whether any of this was done for the community's benefit or for Elevate's. The room held its breath. Constance said, That question is inappropriate, and I'm not going to... Percival from Elevate said, quietly, from his chair near the wall, I think we should probably answer that. Everyone turned to look at him. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was already processing its consequences. Elevate Community Solutions, Percival said, his voice a little unsteady, does receive a percentage of collected fines as part of the management agreement. That structure is disclosed in the contract. He paused. I don't know if the board has ever explained that to the community. I personally think it should have been. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. Constance stood up. This meeting is adjourned, Walter Drummond's voice. This meeting is not adjourned. Board presidents do not have unilateral authority to adjourn an annual meeting once quorum has been established and agenda items remain open. That is, in your own bylaws, Article 12, Section 2. He held up his copy. Shall I read it? She sat back down. The election proceeded. Walter administered it with the unhurried precision of a man who knew exactly how important the moment was and intended to do it right. Ballots were distributed, marked, collected, counted in full view of the room. The results: Theo, Paulette, Celeste, Ferdinand, and I won all 5 contested seats. Constance received 11 votes, the same 11 she'd had when she won the presidency running unopposed. Turns out a block of 11 can look like consensus right up until the rest of the room shows up. Bridget Sauer's photographer got the shot. Walter reading the results aloud, Constance in the background, her expression the precise face of a person experiencing the full weight of play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Bridget's article ran in the Courier 2 days later. The Associated Press picked it up a week after that. The formal paperwork took 4 months, but the moment that mattered happened right there in that beige clubhouse, under buzzing fluorescent lights, while Walter Drummond was still reading the final vote count aloud. Theo leaned over and said quietly, So, what do we do first? I already knew. The new board, Theo, Paulette, Celeste, Ferdinand, and me, held our first official vote before anyone had even folded up their chairs. Motion to place the Elevate Community Solutions contract under immediate review. Passed, 5-0. Motion to freeze all pending fines against Ridgeline property owners pending legal resolution. Passed, 5-0. Percival from Elevate was still sitting in his chair near the wall, looking at his phone like it might rescue him. I walked over. Tell Dwight we'll need a meeting, I said. Monday morning. He can come to us. Percival looked up. Where Where should I tell him to go? Pinecrest Ridge Board Office, I said, which, as of about 10 minutes ago, we run. He typed something into his phone very quickly. The Court of Common Pleas voided the 2019 annexation in July. The ruling was clean and total. Conflict of interest in the annexation process, voting irregularity, undisclosed financial benefit to Elevate. Every fine issued to every Ridgeline property owner under that expanded jurisdiction was nullified. Not reduced, not settled. Nullified. 0. Dwight Feeney resigned from Elevate in August. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office reached a negotiated settlement with Elevate Community Solutions. $340,000 restitution fund distributed across all 14 affected communities, and a permanent removal of performance-based fine collection fees from all Pennsylvania management contracts. Hargrove Finch tracked every single disbursement. He built a new spreadsheet for it. I was not surprised. Constance Aberfoyle did not seek re-election. She sold her Pinecrest Ridge home in September and moved to a planned community in South Carolina. We wished her well. We also quietly hoped that community's HOA kept very good records. In October, I sat down at the kitchen table I'd built from a black walnut slab and signed the terminate notice for Elevate Community Solutions management contract. The same pen I'd used to sign the deed on this land 6 years ago. It was a small moment. Nobody was watching. No cameras, no courtroom, no Walter Drummond with his leather briefcase. Just me, the scratch of a pen, the last of the autumn light coming through the south-facing windows, and the sound of the creek running low and quiet down the slope. And in those 30 days, from the first fine to the election win, I didn't just escape their rules. I became the one deciding who manages them and how. Constance started this with an orange envelope. I ended it with a signature. The thing nobody tells you about fighting back is that the fight itself builds something. Not just legally, not just financially. It builds people together. 41 people showed up to that meeting. Obadiah Rourke found his courage after 3 years of staying quiet. Arlene Toftness signed an affidavit that changed everything. Paulette documented every flyer, every text, every moment Constance overplayed her hand. B. Strickland stood up without being called on and asked the question the room needed to hear out loud. Hargrove drove 90 minutes on a Sunday morning to hand-deliver 97 notices because he believed it mattered. None of this happens alone. That's the only thing I'm certain of. The Ridgeline Community Land Trust was established that November, a nonprofit holding conservation easements on willing property owners' land along the ridge, permanently protecting it from commercial development. Participating owners receive property tax benefits under Pennsylvania's Clean and Green program. The land stays wild. The land stays free. We also created the Denise Winslow Trade Scholarship, named after my wife, who always believed that the most honest work was done with your hands. 3 scholarships a year for Dunmore Falls high school seniors pursuing trades or agricultural education, funded partly by restitution money Hargrove negotiated to flow back to affected communities rather than disappear into legal fees. The first 3 recipients were announced the following spring. I read their names out loud at the ceremony, in the meadow below my cabin, with the creek running behind us and the ridge green above us, and the smell of new grass in the warm May air. Denise would have loved that part best.
30 days, that's all it took. From the morning that orange envelope showed up on gathered door to the night he signed the terminate notice on Avalanche contracts, same pen she used to buy that land. 30 days. And here's the thing that sits with me. Constance had the board. She had the management company. She had the bylaw, the fine structure, the lien process, all of it. On paper, she held every card, but she made one consumption that cost her everything. She assumed Garrett would react the way most people react. Emotionally, impulsively, alone, file a complaint that goes nowhere, make a few angry phone calls, maybe show up to one meeting and embarrass himself. Instead, he went to the library. That's not a small thing when you're that angry, and he had every right to be sitting down and reading instead of swinging. That's harder than it sounds. These HOAs are go the furthest. They're almost always the one that had never had someone come back prepared. They've built to win by exhaustion. What they don't plan for is someone who just keeps showing up quietly with documentation. We've got more stories like this one. Different people, different stages, different HOAs, same playbook. And shame result when someone decides not to fold. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you're right, but fighting back felt impossible? Tell me in the comment. And this one meant something, pass it along. We'll see you on the next one.